The chime of the morning bells broke through the Parisian mist, echoing through narrow tavern-lined streets. Cloaked figures hurried through the chill air, clutching books bound in worn leather. Not priests, but scholars, debating Aristotle and Augustine beneath Notre Dame's soaring towers. In the ancient halls, Latin filled the air, sharp and alive, the language of reason, faith, and ambition. A new world of ideas was being born. Hello, and welcome to Impactful Moments, where we explore some of the most, you guessed it, impactful moments in human history. In this video, we'll trace the rise of the medieval university, an institution that reshaped not just Europe, but the very way humanity pursues knowledge. The Dark Ages, a term often used to describe a period of intellectual decline following the fall of Rome, is in many ways a misnomer. While Western Europe did experience a retreat in learning and literacy, the broader world was anything but dark. Beginning in the 8th century, the Islamic Golden Age thrived from Baghdad to Cordoba, creating vibrant centers of scholarship and scientific discovery. At the same time, civilizations in China, India, and even the Americas were experiencing innovation, producing advancements in medicine, mathematics, and engineering. In contrast, much of Europe had turned inward. Knowledge became the domain of monasteries and cathedral schools. Dating back to the 6th century, monks and nuns held the monopoly on education as they preserved what remained of classical texts. Literacy was confined mostly to the clergy, while the vast majority of the population focused on the daily struggle for survival. This stood in sharp contrast to the classical world that had directly preceded it. The Greeks had pursued knowledge for its own sake, seeking truth through philosophy and debate in schools such as Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. The Romans, ever pragmatic, refined learning into law and rhetoric, tools to govern their vast empire. But when that empire fell, much of its intellectual infrastructure collapsed with it. There were brief revivals, such as Charlemagne's Renaissance in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, yet those were fleeting. But then things began to shift, with the land playing as much a role as society itself. A centuries-long climatic shift, known as the medieval warm period, brought milder temperatures and more predictable growing seasons across much of the continent. This coincided perfectly with the adoption of new farming tools and techniques, such as the heavy plow, the horse collar, and the three-field crop rotation system, innovations that allowed Europeans to take full advantage of the improved climate. Crop yields surged, populations grew, and food surpluses freed many from subsistence farming. For the first time in centuries, significant portions of Europe's population could pursue crafts, trade, and education, pursuits once reserved for the few, giving rise to a new middle class, later classified as the bourgeoisie. As the population expanded, so too did Europe's towns and cities. The 11th century brought an end to Magyar raids from the east and Viking raids from pretty much everywhere, leading to relative security, allowing commerce to flourish. Market towns became bustling commercial centers, and trade networks stretched more securely across the continent. Contact with the Islamic world proved especially transformative. Despite political and religious tensions that fueled the Crusades and the Reconquista, trade routes through places like Sicily and Al-Andalus served as vital intellectual arteries. Through these channels, Europe absorbed the fruits of the Islamic Golden Age. Translation centers, most famously in Toledo, became gateways for rediscovered classical Greek philosophy, preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, and original Islamic works in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Practical technologies, like paper production introduced to Europe from China via the Islamic world, revolutionized how knowledge was shared, directly fueling Europe's intellectual awakening. Yet even with this influx of ideas, the church still held the key to education. Books were expensive and knowledge wasn't seen as practical, but that monopoly was about to loosen. By the 11th century, the papacy had embarked on major reform movements under leaders like Gregory VII. Seeing the rising populations, growing cities, and strengthening monarchies across Europe, the church sought to expand its own authority. In 1079, Gregory VII issued a decree calling for every cathedral to establish its own school. Many of these institutions had existed for centuries, but now they took on new life, becoming centers of advanced instruction that drew ambitious students from across Europe. As church and state wrestled for supremacy in events like the investiture controversy, and as Europe's economy grew more complex, there rose an urgent need for men skilled in both canon law, the church's internal legal system, and the newly rediscovered Roman law, preserved by the Corpus Juris Civilis. These subjects quickly became the most prestigious fields of study. But the church's decree had opened the floodgates. The explosive demand for higher education soon overwhelmed the cathedral school's ability to meet it. They lacked standardized curricula, consistent oversight, and above all, qualified teachers. Into this vacuum stepped the magister, or independent master. With the influx of knowledge, people had been gathering for independent study for decades, and many of them essentially put their knowledge up for hire. These scholars operated outside direct church control, offering specialized instruction to anyone willing to pay. In Bologna, for example, a teacher named Irnerius was renowned for his mastery of Roman law, attracting pupils from across Europe. For the first time in centuries, students traveled specifically in search of higher learning. These masters were granted the licentia docendi, a license to teach anywhere. Yet this academic migration brought new tensions. The rapid influx of foreign students and teachers into small medieval cities created constant friction with locals, a dynamic known as town versus gown, gown referencing the academic garb. Non-local students, or extranei, were easy targets for exploitation. Landlords inflated rents, merchants raised prices, and city authorities offered little sympathy. Meanwhile, students and masters holding clerical status were tried under more lenient church law rather than local courts, further stoking local resentment. The result was frequent, often violent, clashes between townspeople and scholars. To protect themselves, these academic communities began to organize, adopting the most successful social model of the Middle Ages, the guild. These self-governing corporations of masters and students took on the Latin word for guild, universitates. Sound familiar? Acting collectively, they wielded real power. By threatening to strike or relocate entirely, they could pressure towns, bishops, and even kings to grant them privileges. The first true model of this academic world emerged in Bologna around 1088. Initially a universitas scholarium, a guild of students rather than teachers, Bologna's scholars hired and paid their own masters, setting fees and conditions. While Bologna set the stage and embodied a student-driven model, Paris became its own teacher-driven counterpart. By 1150, it had emerged as the leading center for theology and the liberal arts, organized as a universitas magistrorum, a guild of masters controlling the curriculum and examinations. Whether the student or master's model, universities soon developed a shared academic structure that defined European higher learning. A common hierarchy of degrees took shape, starting with the bachelor, representing a completion of liberal arts studies, and ultimately a master or doctor, which conferred the licentia docendi, the universal license to teach, often focusing on professional faculties of law, medicine, or theology. Universities spread quickly across Europe, securing legal autonomy by obtaining charters from emperors and popes by the mid-12th century, formally recognizing them as independent corporations. Schools like Oxford, founded around 1157 by scholars fleeing Paris, and Cambridge, born from an Oxford town versus gown dispute in 1209, spread these models to new areas. By the 13th century, the structure of higher learning had become universal. The bachelor, master, and doctor were all recognized across borders. A scholar from Paris could teach in Bologna, Oxford, or anywhere else, creating a unified international community of learning. Enjoying so far? Give us a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know and keeps this kind of content coming. In the decades following their rise, universities reshaped Europe both practically and socially. A new educated class emerged: clerics, jurists, physicians, and administrators trained not only in theology, but in logic, law, and medicine. Monarchs and popes began drawing heavily from this pool of scholars to staff their bureaucracies. In England, Henry II relied on legally trained clerics to help shape the foundations of common law, including Thomas Becket, educated in Bologna, a connection that would lead to its own famous conflict. Across the continent, other canonists from Bologna standardized church procedure and jurisprudence. What began as academic specialization soon became the administrative backbone of both church and state. As the model spread, new centers of learning arose. Salamanca in 1218, Spain's first, Padua in 1222, and Naples in 1224, along with Oxford and Cambridge, which broke away from Paris to establish its own tradition of scholarship. Within this world, major philosophical figures emerged who came to define the era, notably Albertus Magnus and his more renowned disciple, Thomas Aquinas. Certain philosophies had worried the church, and many works, notably from Aristotle, were even banned in universities given their seeming contradiction with ecclesiastical teachings. This gave rise to scholars such as Aquinas, who sought to reconcile faith and reason. His Summa Theologica became the cornerstone of scholastic thought, a method of dialectical reason that examined contradictions and revealed higher truths. Aquinas' methodology also furthered the traditional university structure of learning, which centered around both lecture, in which information was delivered by a master, and disputation, in which students would debate potential outcomes and solutions. Other thinkers, like Oxford-trained Roger Bacon, pushed the boundaries of inquiry in different directions, championing what he called scientia experimentalis, or experimental science. He argued that mathematics and empirical testing were essential to verifying knowledge. This early empiricism laid the foundation for the scientific method, showing that universities were not only centers of preservation and synthesis, but engines of discovery. Let's be clear. European universities were by no means the first houses of study. The Greek world had Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. Judaism fostered rigorous scholarship in the Talmudic academies of Rome and Yavne and the Babylonian centers of Sura and Pumbedisa. The Islamic world gave rise to Baghdad's Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, as well as hundreds or even thousands of Golden Age madrasas. In Southeast Asia, institutes like Nalanda and Taxila flourished as global centers of philosophy and medicine in the ancient world, while China's imperial academies trained generations of scholar officials in Confucian classics. Even Fez's University of Al-Qarawiyyin, a degree-granting school that still operates today, preceded Bologna by more than 2 centuries. What made the European universities unique wasn't their pursuit of knowledge, it was their structure. They evolved into self-governing corporations of students and masters, independent from both crown and church, united by a shared system of degrees and credentials. This model, worldly, portable, and standardized, could spread, replicate, and adapt across borders. It marked the beginning of a truly institutionalized form of education, one that would outlive kingdoms and empires. In the centuries that followed, the model transformed the world. Universities became the custodian of intellectual continuity through the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. Their method of structured debate and credentialed expertise helped standardize knowledge and professionalize disciplines. Graduates trained in logic and law staffed courts and governments. Those versed in natural philosophy advanced medicine and the sciences. When printing democratized access to ideas, universities became both the battlegrounds and breeding grounds for reform, producing thinkers who would challenge authority not only in theology, but in politics, economics, and science. By the modern era, the legacy of these medieval institutions had gone global. Colonial expansion, trade, and later modernization efforts carried the university model to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, where it merged with local traditions of learning. What began as an experiment in collective learning became one of civilization's most enduring creations, a framework not just for preserving knowledge, but for questioning it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found this period in history both informative and enlightening. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you can join us for another video. Thanks for watching.